Welcome to Legal Innovation Spotlight, the podcast that brings you the latest advancements in legal tech and knowledge management. I'm Ted Theodoropoulos, and I connect with the industry's brightest minds to provide you with valuable insights and actionable takeaways. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Christian, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing good, Ted. How are you?
I'm doing great. Really appreciate you spending a few minutes with me today. You and I got connected on LinkedIn. I think I remember the post. I think it was Copilot maybe, and It could have been that Jeff Teeper video that I've talked about a couple of times where they were saying that Jeff was talking about Copilot and where it gets its data and where people engage with it most. One, that being Teams, and then where it gets its data from SharePoint, and just kind of questioning ROI. And you popped in and mentioned that you do some fractional, I guess you call it a fractional chief AI officer, which I thought was super interesting. So we connected, and I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. You dig pretty deep. But before we get too far, why don't you just do a quick introduction and tell us about your background and what you're doing today?
Yeah, well, and thanks, Ted. And I feel like the Copilot discussion's changed so much since we were talking about that post with everything that's happened, right? But yeah,
Agreed.
I guess, a little bit about myself. So my name is Christian Brown. I'm the founder of Code Counsel, PLLC. It's a law firm out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we really specialize in focusing on how to identify the pain points that law firms and legal techs are facing trying to integrate legal tech, particularly generative AI, and helping fix those pain points, right? And so that can be everything from helping them with a roadmap all the way through implementation of their use cases for whether that's an AI tool or a machine learning tool or something else for that use case. Or it could be like, one of the big players in the legal tech space that needs somebody to help with A/B testing or needs some qualitative analysis on one of their tools that they're preparing for attorneys and needs somebody that understands how to give that perspective, but also the technical side of what they're trying to do with the feedback and where they're trying to get. And so that's kind of where Code Counsel came from.
Interesting. Yeah, and since we got connected on LinkedIn, I've seen your post. Man, you really get down deep into the engineering level with some of this stuff, which I find totally fascinating. But as an attorney, you're an attorney, and clearly you've got some engineering interest and capability because you're picking these things apart, running local LLMs, talking about benchmarking between different AI providers. So yeah, when I think attorney, it's like a lot of times I forget which hemisphere of the brain it is, but where language and arts and those sorts of things, and then you have math and logic, and to have depth on both sides is I guess unusual. I don't know, maybe it's not, but you're how did you fall down this AI rabbit hole?
Yeah. I forget which hemisphere it is too, but it was definitely, I always thought I was on the logical math side for the longest time, right? I went to school, thought I was going to be a litigator coming out, bad time to come out right during the financial crisis. And so ended up falling into kind of default servicing, and the technical side of my career really came from necessity. I mean, the bottom line is I had some type of analysis job or some type of legal job that I was trying to do in each of these roles. And I could not get my hands on the information I needed to be able to get to the answers or fix the bigger problem, right? And most of the time it was that. Like I could find the answer for this one, but I could see a bigger problem, but I could not get my hands on it or communicate with somebody else on how to get me the information. So I started learning SQL because most of the databases we were dealing with were SQL. So I could just run my own queries and start to get my hands on that information. And it just is honestly snowballed from there. That rolled into Power BI because I wanted to be able to create some reports and some visualizations and try to understand looking at law a little bit differently and the practice of that. And then I ended up being with a hedge fund that trades in this the secondary market for residential forward and reverse mortgages. And so that's a ton of data. I mean, we were sitting on just a trove of data, doing due diligence and asset management. So skills just got expanded from there. And as most people, I think, that are deep in the space feel, November 2022, everything just changed at that point. It was like, okay, now whatever skill I want to learn, I need to go out there and start acquiring it because it's available.
Yeah. So I started down the path on the SQL side as well. I think that's a common entry point for folks because they want to get their hands on information, and in order to do that, you're either relying on a tech partner who within the business who may or may not be you may or may not be their highest priority. So it's kind of like, all right, figure out how to get your hands dirty and get it yourself, or wait. And many of us don't like to wait. So yeah, I came up the ranks there too. I've been really fascinated to just see kind of the evolution of these different AI platforms. And it's really kind of been open AI. It seems like to me, you know a lot more about this than I do, but it seems like it's really been kind of like I saw your post about LLMs and chatbots and the performance benchmarking that's taken place. And I think this is really kind of indicative, even more broadly than just in the chatbot space. But yeah, it's been OpenAI and Anthropic have been, and then there's everybody else. But it seems like in the chart that you show at the end of it is indicative of this, that it's not like that anymore. Like Google has caught up. What is your lay of the land in terms of what the capabilities look like amongst the different providers?
Yeah, I mean, I was just looking at some stats the other day. I think I'm trying to remember. I want to say it was from just a newsletter that I get. I want to say from Sugarb. He does a B2B CEO newsletter that he puts out, and it had a statistic in it. In 2023, there were 149 new foundational models put onto the market. And most of those were open source, right? And so what's been crazy and I think proliferating to watch this year is how quickly open source is catching up closer to those foundations, right? There's no question, like you said, ChatGPT is out in the lead, and I think Anthropic is playing close, but we're all waiting for the next shoe to drop, later this year to that next model. But how quickly open source is closing that gap is changed. And we've seen that in everything from foundational models, but you're also seeing it in technology like, one of my favorites is Perplexity. I absolutely love using Perplexity for search because of its functionality and its logical thought process and how I can see it and the sources. There are 6 or 7 GitHubs you can pull up today that have already recreated that interface, that you can change out the search engines behind them, that you can run and serve locally on your computer and be model agnostic and flip between the different models or have your own proprietary model. And that's available to everyday users. And that's, I think, what has changed, right? Because used to, you couldn't do a one-click GitHub and have something like that running on your MacBook, but you can today. And you don't necessarily have to understand how all the pieces work if you understand the technology in general.
Yeah, I think Perplexity is awesome as well. I enjoy it, but I feel like it's just Google is going to crush them. I mean, it seems like that's inevitable. In fact, I've done some reading a little bit. It seems like they're already that process is already underway. I mean, do you think they can survive competing against a Google that has all of these resources?
Yeah, I admire the Perplexity team a lot. One, for what they've built with the team that they have. I think there's only 50 of them on that team as of today. And that product that they're supporting today was built, I think, started with like a team of like 4 or 5 people. So I think that's pretty impressive. And I think they have created somewhat of a moat, and they've changed the way that people look at search, the expectation of what you get back from search. And I think that's all pretty revolutionary. But I think they're also smart enough to understand that is a lot of compound system engineering and not a whole lot of widening the moat from a got a better model, or I've got better hardware, or I've got, some type of multimodal approach that somebody else hasn't come up with yet. And so, and I think you see that in their marketing approach, right? I mean, it's partnership deal after partnership deal right now to get their ties in with different people. But I do think they can survive, and I think it's the innovation. And I think we're going to start to see more innovation coming from them because they understand that their moat's not huge. I think they've forced Google to rethink search. I mean, we can't understate that, and OpenAI is out there trying to compete too. They won't say it out loud, but they are. I mean, I just actually just signed in today to the MacBook app, the native app. I'm just going to start testing that out today and see what that's like to be working with it, where it can, start to interact with my computer more for me. I think Perplexity's definitely got challenges, and I think that it'll be interesting to see how they tackle them. But I don't think they're just going to go away. I think what is going to go away is that traditional search, and especially the most recent search world that we've been in, where you don't get your best hits. The user's not getting the best experience. The ads are, or the search function that they're trying to roll out is. And I think that this rethinking is forcing all of them to rethink that, because now AI is focused, or they at least want it to be focused and personalized, right? You were talking a little bit earlier about on edge, right? We want to get to where it's just an easy interaction, right? That's the hardest thing to get past, is how do I just make this a fluid, easy interaction where it's easier than if I typed it myself, or if I pulled that up myself and then put that information myself. And you can see all of them competing that, and a big part of that is search. I mean, we spend most of our time either Google searching or talking to somebody else or looking in a book, or, looking for some source of information. They're trying to find that initial source for you all the time. And that's the feature I love about Perplexity, right? When I go to do a search, they're my starting place because they give me the grounds to then go do the next level. And maybe that's outside of Perplexity. Maybe I've got to go to like a legal search engine, or I've got to go ask an expert or talk to somebody like you after I, come across your article or something. But it's a starting place that helps me to that next step every time and helps along the way. And that's what we need AI to be for people, for the adoption to be to the level that I think people expect.
Yeah, what's interesting, I also read about Google's challenge with content providers. So is it called One Box, where you do a search and then underneath it tries to answer the question for you without you clicking the link? And the implications are to the content provider. Like, let's say, I'm writing a detailed blog about legal intranets that's very niche. We're one of a very small number of vendors who are zeroed in on that space. So when we write something and Google takes it and either presents it in a one box or presents it as an answer rather than a link to my page, that hurts me. So how I don't know, do you have any read on how they're going to manage that? I've read things like they could potentially do licensing deals, kind of like Spotify does with their artists, where, Spotify pays based on, the number of plays that an artist generates. But, I think so far, like Perplexity's been able to get away with that. They're small. Their pockets aren't nearly as deep as Google's. I feel like the lawsuits are coming on this. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I mean, this and other issues, right? I mean, I think last count when I checked earlier this week, I think we've got 30 active AI lawsuits in the United States right now. Some of them copyright, some other issues. You've heard the voice ones with the Sky voice most recently with and I mean, there's so much, risk when you're diving into an experimental area and trying to put it everywhere at once. That we're definitely experiencing that, and search is no different. I mean, SEO has fundamentally changed overnight. It has to, if these products are going to go into play, because the structure of it doesn't work, at least the way it's set up today. And I don't know the solution yet, Ted. I mean, the truth is, the problem is more the way that ads and money drive the back of that, right? Because the reason you want people to come to your site is because that's ads and money, right? And the same reason Google wants people to use those links. That system's got to change. How we're compensating people for their contributions to that transaction has to change. And I don't know the answer there. I think we're facing that problem in a lot of spaces at the same time. Some of that to me is rethinking, how we share that information and how you display it and user experience. I don't think Perplexity's found the answer, but I think I do find myself clicking through 5, 6, 7 sources when I'm doing research in Perplexity, right? And that is taking me to their site. It's going to cut down the overall numbers like Google used to have it, because you had to click through 5 or 6 sources to find the one source, right? And Perplexity is saying, here is the best source. But I do think it means that there's more engagement with those sources. I can't tell you how many more times I've engaged with the website, meaning I've either, gone through a contact page, or I've downloaded a report from the website, or I've pulled up a YouTube page from the website because Perplexity got me there. And then that next step was going deeper down that dive. And I think there's an opportunity there to figure out a model that makes sense, right? But Google has to be willing to play ball, right? They have to be willing to change the structure in the background, because we just play by the rules. We don't get to set them in play right now.
Yeah, and it depends really on the level of depth of your inquiry, right? If you're asking, how many law firms have Microsoft Teams deployed, you're just looking for a number, like you're probably not going to go deep on that, right? They're just going to provide the answer, and that's going to be the end of the process. But yeah, for scenarios that aren't so quantitative, where there's more in-depth interaction with the underlying content that's required, then I guess some mechanisms to drive traffic would remediate some of the challenges.
Yeah, and I think there's a technical solution too, right? But it would take all the players being willing to play. Is there microtransactions in the background, right? I mean, you could set up a chain of smart contracts with microtransactions. Every time a Perplexity result pulled in your data to synthesize the response, you get a micro transaction. But it would require a changing of that infrastructure, and that's the challenge, right? I mean, the ad dollars that you were asking to change there and potentially compensate more contributors, not less, in that type of structure, I think would make more for a fair structure and make more content more valuable, but it also decreases one side of the equation. There's a finite amount of money that's there for all the parties to take right now. Now, I think that will change if people are smart about it and think about the technology and the structure and the opportunity. But that's one of those things we're waiting to see what happens, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so diving in more in the legal context here. So, how do you feel about AI's ability or opportunity in terms of enhancing capabilities of attorneys, with the vast amount of legal knowledge that's out there, and doing that in a more efficient way? Like, how do you see these technologies improving those capabilities for boots on the ground, practice of law type of work?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest impacts I notice personally with AI right away is that my continuous learning patterns change, right? So all of a sudden I could go pretty in depth with a topic to a level where I'd be comfortable talking with somebody else that knows a lot about it very, very quickly. Whereas before it may take hours or days to do that research to get to that level, right? And I think that is one of the ways firms and attorneys can think about it in general, is continuous learning both inside and outside of the firm has changed. And I'm talking about base level when you're bringing in that new hire, there's new ways to train them and they can be personalized. There are simulations that you can run today with clients that you couldn't before to get ready for litigation. There are devil's advocate conversations you can have with yourself about your legal arguments that you couldn't before. And that person on the other side can be a good adversary to help you flush those things out. And I think getting to the point where attorneys are in that continuous learning mode all the time and not just when they want to expand into a practice area or they've got to get a CLE done. I think that's one of the biggest ways that AI can enhance a firm, because you can personalize that and you can standardize it, right? I have had to, with just the amount of stuff that's happening on a daily basis, almost hourly basis at this point, I've had to say, okay, I'm not as a human capable of ingesting and processing all that information every day, all day, every day. There's not enough time in the day. But with a little bit of technology and, probably a good 5 to 10 hours of time in, I've got a process in place, a compound system that uses AI tech, but also some other things I put in place that distills a whole bunch of different pieces of information and creates a one-page sheet for me to focus on that's going to highlight the things that I think are important to me and the things that I need for, if I'm doing a LinkedIn post or if I'm, doing a podcast or something like that. So things like that, getting attorneys to that mindset. I think AI, if you get them to invest enough time to get to that level where the tool is showing them personal pain points it can resolve, you're changing your continuous learning, and that bleeds into your knowledge management, right? I think your ingestion and organization of your knowledge and your case information and client information should be supercharged. You should be finding a way to use AI to supercharge that. And that, bleeds into, I think, a bigger issue of just underlying databases for firms across the board. But using AI to just help you do a better job of organizing your documents, organizing your data, and getting it into a more usable asset form, it should be something that every technology firm team is looking into, right? Because we all know that is where the time consuming and difficult aspects of the job are for knowledge management and IT. But if you can supercharge yourself, who already should have that knowledge or some level of knowledge of what's needed, and supercharge yourself and scale yourself out, all of a sudden you can have a big effect without, necessarily growing your team. I think those are two areas that they stick out to me. And I think this is probably because of my background, but the data analytics sides for firm management, just overall, you're from your traditional KPIs for business firm management all the way up to starting to use things like visualization tools like Power BI and going into AI tools. There's just a huge opportunity to apply analytics to how you practice or how you litigate that attorneys just haven't traditionally thought that way, because I was one. That I've seen that side. I know what it was like before you kind of take the data blinders off, and once you take those blinders off, it's a different perspective. It's a good perspective to have, and everything else you saw before is important, but you just are able to see it a little bit differently.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how big a hill to climb do you think is the data and content problem at law firms? Like, most big law firms have grown through M&A, right? They've merged with other firms, acquired other firms, and you've got bad data, like on top of bad data that's been rolled into, very fragmented taxonomies, and it's a mess. Like, it's especially document management systems that lawyers have historically not done a good job, profiling their documents, for example, and not cleaning up after themselves and removing documents from matter workspaces that didn't get used or were irrelevant or whatever. So it's just not really been cared for very well in most big law firms. And it feels like that's going to have an impact on AI, right? That's going to eventually, like today, it's locked away in a document management system, but I know there's been some announcements recently about, iManage and partnerships with Microsoft. But how big a hill is that to climb?
It's the first thing that I address and tackle with my clients if I'm consulting them on, potentially implementing an AI tool. First, before anything, we need to look at your database and your data strategy, right? Because at the end of the day, put AI tools aside, even just your legal tech tools that are on the market today. If your database and your documents are not organized, the utility of that tool is rarely going to reach a level where you feel like you got your ROI. And you're definitely not going to get a level of adoption, because my experience as an attorney and with working with attorneys trying to get them to adopt tools is you get maybe one chance to show them it can do it better than they do. And once you blow that one chance, it's done. It doesn't matter how much you advance it. It doesn't matter how many times you retrain. They have moved on and they're not going to go back to it. Right. And I think we have seen this problem over and over in the industry, and both whether you're talking in-house counsel or you're talking, small firms, solo attorneys, all the way up to enterprises, is the tools can be awesome, but we are terrible at adopting them and we are terrible at giving them enough time to make a difference. And that is what I think with the data management side of it, it's the same approach the attorneys have taken, right? And that's why I think you've got to tackle that problem first and foremost. So every time I'm advising, we look at that database, we say, what's the structure? Do you know what type of database you have? What's the structure? Who's hosting it? How does that tie into your overall platform? And then you go from there. And I think we will very quickly see in the industry, more firms are going to spend time, if they don't think about it ahead, going back to try to fix their database to get the new tool that they bought to work the way they want to or to the level of accuracy that they needed, and vice versa. If a firm is focused on their data strategy today, and maybe they don't get that AI tool out until 6 months from now, but they got their database and their data strategy in place, then 6 months from now, they're going to be ready to go and they're going to be iterating on that. And they're going to be implementing the next model, or the next function, or the next structure, or whatever the case may be. They're not going to be saying, "Hey, we just spent all this time and we still can't get to production. We still can't expose it to our clients. We can't even use it internally," right? And that's the other side of that hill. I think you can look at firms now, and there's been some rumblings, I think, in the underbelly of the market about, okay, all these big firms that have adopted the tools so far, like, where are the benchmarks? Where are the results? What are we not seeing? Was it? I think it was Price. Was it PricewaterhouseCoopers Bloomberg, that did their whole, spun up all of their GPT, did all of their personalized training and everything, and it was a crumble. It failed for them. It wasn't as efficient as the people or as the most recent model that was out at the time. And they just didn't think about those things beforehand. I think if you think about the data beforehand, it's a different animal.
Yeah, I say old. There's really nothing old when we're talking about AI, but what's quickly becoming a cliche, but it's so true, is IA before AI, right? It's information architecture, and all of that matters. You had mentioned getting attorneys to experiment and do so safely and compliantly. Like, what can law firms do to encourage attorneys, get them to the table, and to experiment with AI the right way, in a way that's not going to land them on the cover of the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah. I think that first step is recognizing that, whether you have a strategy in place or whether you're deploying AI tools or not, that your attorneys and staff are. There was just I think it was a LinkedIn and Microsoft study that they did together, and 75%, I want to say, of knowledge workers admitted that they were using AI at work, and almost half of those were within the last 6 months. But only 39% were using it because their employers had made it available to them, or they had received some type of training. Or so, the risk that you're worried about, right? That people are using tools in ways that could expose your data and your firm to potential risk. It's happening whether you put a strategy in place or not. And I think that's the first step, right? Firms, if you want to get attorneys or your staff to do it compliantly, give them a defined avenue to do so, and there's a lot of ways I think you can do that. And there's a lot of different, both open and closed models and platforms that you can work with to try to do that in a compliant manner. But today it's more available than it's ever been. Without any technical experience, you can work with OpenAI today now and get to where, they have a free account with the latest model and can do a lot of testing and downloading of the information right there. And you can opt out of sharing that information too. But to do that, you've also got to have some policies in place, right? You've got to have a little bit of training on what you can and cannot upload into that. You've got to have some parameters in place on who has access to it. And, I never recommend a full rollout. You want to piece this out and get both feedback and buy-in along the way, and see the risk and the dangers. And most importantly, firms have to be willing to experiment. I think we are so risk averse, and understandably so. But in today's world, if you're not experimenting on this side, then you're falling behind, and you're going to have to end up doing one of two things: buy it from somebody else so that you can do those things down the road, or play catch up. And either one of those, I just think is a losing game with how quickly everything's advancing, right? If you just put a little bit of time and thought into it now, particularly if you look at your data, and the tools that your team is using. I mean, I've told so many firms, just ask your staff, like, what are you using? You're not going to be in trouble. Tell me what you're using and why. How does it make it easier? Because some of the best ideas, I've spun up a few custom GPTs using OpenAI for firms for basic functions that they were doing, but the idea came from the staff because they're the one that was doing the work. And they said, well, I have to do this over and over every day. So I just figured out I could do this and I don't have to. And everybody else was like, well, we need to do that everywhere. Right. And I mean, those are the types of things. And sometimes that's an AI solution. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a workflow change. Sometimes it's a document automation change. But if you can get the excitement, get them on that side, give them somewhere they can do it and they know it's okay and they're not going to be in trouble, or at least a place where you can collect what's happening so you can see what happens and use that as feedback and loop that back in. That's half the battle. Give them some rules, let them know it's okay, and then let it go. And it doesn't. The beauty of it today is it doesn't have to cost a firm anything to do that today. It doesn't mean you have every capability, but most people just want to start with the simple things. See if it can summarize a document really well for you. See if it can extract information and without making a mistake out of a document for you. Things like that. Those things, they apply to law firms, but they apply everywhere.
How much exposure have you had to some of the legal specific tools out there, like, Harvey or DraftWise? What Clear Brief? Like, have you had any exposure to them? And if so, what are your initial reactions?
Yeah, I think the most exciting part of my practice that I'm really enjoying is the advising at the legal tech sphere side. So I get an opportunity with a lot of the tools to be an A/B tester or to do qualitative testing for them. And so some of the ones you mentioned, I've been able to do that for. And I have definitely been impressed with how quickly they've moved and how well it's organized with different tools. Whether we're talking about a legal research tool, you've got everything from Harvey to Paxton to Law Droid that are out there that are providing things like that. Or you've got, there's some free ones out there like Describe AI. That's a completely free resource right now with a whole database of all of case law out there for people to be able to search. Yeah. Being able to see those, I think the big players have created a first mover moat, no question. And I think the tools are reaching levels where they can be beneficial if the users learn how to use them and can work them into their workflows. The problem I think that we continue to have across the board, whether it's a big player or a small player, is how do you integrate that as easily as possible into each law firm's workflow today? And I think some of the players have made good moves by implementing it as an add-in on Microsoft Word. I think you mentioned Clear Brief. Clear Brief is one that I've demoed, and it's just right there. And that ease of use, it'll compete with me going to ChatGPT, right? If I've got to click into another screen, if that ease of use is just right there. And so I think that is. I think the big players are figuring out how to get to that solution, but I don't think we're there yet. The truth is, I just think overall we're not there yet. And that's why we're not seeing benchmarks and results come out from any of the big players on look how much better we are. You're seeing a little bit of it from Westlaw and LexisNexis, right, as they've rolled out their tools. But anything outside of that, I think they're still trying to figure out what's the best approach. What's the best architecture to get to that result? What's the best citation checker? There's just a lot of challenges that come there. I have a lot of optimism, though, a lot of optimism. At the same time, I tell firms, don't be tied to a vendor. You want to be thinking 2-3 years down the road, right? And those may be the best today, but what you're building, that architecture, both from a data standpoint and from a machine learning or ML ops standpoint, you want that to be solid for the next 2 to 3 years. And so there's a lot of techniques and strategies, especially with the open source community today, that you can take there to set yourself up without spending a ton of money. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see which ones are still in the market in 2 years, from consolidation to breaking apart. I will be interested to see who's still going to be around. It's kind of like the perplexity question, right? Like I have a lot of hope for perplexity, but is it possible in 2 years that they're not around it? Absolutely it is.
Yeah. And, that from a funding, from a capital markets perspective, I know there's a lot of talk about us being in the trough of disillusionment on the Gartner hype curve now. But I can tell you this, I keep my finger on the pulse of the capital markets reasonably well, and the multiples that AI startups are receiving are vastly different than those that aren't. And as long as people are writing checks, you're going to have, and not really, it makes me think back to, during post-COVID when there was trillions of dollars of liquidity that was injected into the economy, and that money had to find a home, right?
Mm-hmm.
It sitting on the sidelines, especially once inflation really started to rear its ugly head, sitting on the sideline with capital became a liability, because that money is losing purchasing power. So that capital had to be deployed, and the capital markets are rewarding in a big way. I mean, sometimes 3-4x the
Mm-hmm.
multiples that the non-AI startups are that are in play there. So I think we're going to continue to see a lot of innovation. I think we're going to get to see, to your point, startups that are here today and gone tomorrow, just because that's the nature of the beast. In the venture world, it's a high risk, high reward proposition, and it's just the reality that there's going to be some churn there. What are your thoughts on you mentioned multimodal with Perplexity? Like, what are your thoughts on ChatGPT 4.0 and their announcement? I think it was just last week. It seems like it's been forever now, but what are your thoughts, initial take on that?
Yeah, I think I'm officially 5 days into really being able to replace a lot of the tools that I'm using and put that model in and switch it out. In particular, one of the things I work with a lot that I've been experimenting is Open Interpreter. So it's basically an LLM-driven operating assistant for your computer, right? So just think of it, similar to what you're seeing with Microsoft and OpenAI coming out now. There's been a tool that's been out in the open source market for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 months now that can do a lot of things. You just have to do a lot of programming with it to get it there right now. And so before the new model came out, it was really good at doing things, but I would run into problems where it would time out or it would hit token limits, or, it would just do things inefficiently. I'd be trying to get it to write a simple piece of code, and it would take way, way too many tokens to get me to that final answer. I flipped the other model in, and it just changed things. There's a conciseness to the responses that come back. You can tell there's been some guardrails and engineering done on that side to help with that. But then the efficiency of it. I mean, the cost efficiency, obviously the inference cost is huge. I think it's 1/10 the cost of GPT-4 Turbo. So that, for anybody thinking about inference, that's huge. I mean, that's a game changer for what your costs were before. But the latency has been completely different. And obviously that makes sense if they're trying to get to those voice demos that we saw, right? You've got to have almost zero latency at human level latency for it to be that level of comfortability. But when I was just working from my terminal when I was talking to it, but there was none. It was instantaneous. It was concise. It got me to my results. And, I just put out a demo video yesterday. I was manipulating an Excel file. Basically, I asked it to go find the Excel file on my desktop. It was a dummy data file that I needed to create. I was creating a whole bunch of fake names and addresses for a dummy data set. I asked it if it could go in and generate all of the dummy data for me and then do that in 2 different files and make them all real addresses, states, cities and states, but obviously not tied to any real people. And I think the video's less than 4 minutes long, and it did it perfectly. And that would have been a 2-hour process for me. And it's just those things. I mean, it is crazy how quickly we are advancing in those areas. And touching on the point you mentioned, the multiples that you're seeing invested at the AI startup in the legal space is crazy. But what caught my eye is enterprises' willingness to spend going into 2024, right? I think A16Z had a survey that said enterprises invested like $17 million in GA last year on average, right? Most of them have a plan to 2 to 5x that for this year, right? So lots of legal tech money to do a startup, but there's a lot of money if you can do services well. And some of these are services that people are already experts at. They just need to figure out how to implement AI into their process or into their workflows to get that type of work. The money's there this year because enterprises don't have a choice, right? It's almost like I feel like law firms are kind of approaching. You're not going to have a choice of whether to adopt AI or not. You're either going to be expected to by your clients, or you're going to be pushed out of the market by your competitors that did.
Yeah. Yeah. On the last, I can't remember if it was last episode or actually a couple episodes ago, I had on a legal CIO. He talked about the firm or about the concept of, instead of ROI, CONI, like the cost of not investing. And that has to be also evaluated. And from a competitive standpoint, there are real implications there. And I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you, like, what do you feel like is the most common issue related to AI that attorneys and law firms that we're not talking about enough today? Like, what would you put? And there could be multiple things here, but what would you put at the top of that list?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on data a lot, and I think, I don't want to feel like I'm hyper focused on it, but law firms have never looked at data as an asset, as a cash flowing asset. And I think very quickly, what is clear to me is as we try to continue to advance these models, we need more data, right? And not just, generalized internet scraped data. We're going to need a certain level of specialized data, depending on what you're trying to do. That can come in my mind in 2 places, right? You've got your general models that you're just trying to make smarter, right? And that's everybody's racing for that foundational level. But then you have your special purpose models. Microsoft just released a ton of 8 billion or less parameter models. Phi's been out there for a while. And what I'm at least seeing from researchers, what they're doing is they're finding ways to make them hyper efficient at doing 1 or 2 tasks, right? And then you've got your foundational model that can take a query in and say, oh, this is what the user's asking for. I know about this other model over here that's the perfect expert to do this. Let me ask it to do it for it, and then I'll feed it back to the user. That is where I see just a completely different approach, right? And that all comes down to the firm's data, right? The way you get to that specialized model that's really good at doing whatever stuff you did before is you say, how did you do it? And where's all the data from when you were doing that, right? You need to teach it your steps, your logic, and you need the data to show it examples of what was the output and where you got to. And the beauty of AI is sometimes that only takes a couple of examples and a little bit of training, or sometimes it takes more and you got to do more fine tuning and more prompting and get a little bit more technical. But nobody understands completely why today, but sometimes it doesn't take much at all. And I think that if firms can understand that data can be a cash flowing asset, then they can approach knowledge management and innovation different, both in how they hire and staff their teams, but also, thinking about the services that you're offering, right? Your law service that you've used people to do before can become a product pretty quickly if you're able to capture that in a really easy way or in a really defined and easy to use way. And so that all comes down to that
Agreed.
data
I've
strategy.
seen that concept in action. We have a client, Ogletree Deacons. They have presented on this. They just presented on it at the last conference I was at. Yeah, man, their KM department is actually generating revenue, which is an interesting concept and one that I think people are really interested in, that, you know, a KM department can be a revenue center instead of a cost center. That's not always been the case. And, you know, as a executive committee member of a big law firm, I'd be really interested to hear how that could happen. So yeah, those are really good points. This has been a great conversation. I feel like we could talk all day about this stuff. It's like, if we haven't even like remotely scratched the surface, it's just, and even if we did 3 months from now, it's going to be a completely different conversation. So yeah, I'd love to have you back at some point. I think the stuff that you're doing is somewhat unique because you're getting in there at really a very detailed level, and you know, not just a bunch of hand waving. And I mean, there's been some skepticism with some of these vendors. You may have seen some of I saw a poll the other day about whether or not a certain vendor is operating in secret or just trying to create hype by not sharing details about what they're doing. I'm not going to say the name, but I'm sure people can figure it out. So yeah, this has been really good. I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us. And like I said, I'd love to have you back at some point as a follow-up to talk about all the new stuff that'll be out there in the next couple of months.
Absolutely, Ted. No, it's been a pleasure being on. I do feel like we could talk about this forever, but I'm happy to come back at any point. And, you know, if you've got questions or anybody else out there, just reach out to me. I'll be honest, I can't help but just start going once somebody asks me an interesting question at this point.
Yeah, good stuff. And what's the best way for folks to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Christian Brown on LinkedIn. Email is christian@codeandcounsel.ai. We just launched our website earlier this month, so come check us out and give me a shout.
Good stuff. All right. Well, thanks again for the time, and we'll chat soon.
All right. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Legal Innovation Spotlight. If you found value in this chat, hit the subscribe button to be notified when we release new episodes. We'd also really appreciate it if you could take a moment to rate us and leave us a review wherever you're listening right now. Your feedback helps us provide you with top-notch content. Want to dive deeper into the world of legal innovation? Connect with us online at getinfo-.com, where you'll find additional resources and articles. You can also follow us on social media at getinfo- to stay updated on the latest news and insights in the field of legal tech and knowledge management. Once again, thank you for joining us today on Legal Innovation Spotlight, a fireside chat series hosted by Info-.